Let's face it, folks, if you are not watching The Kings, the 4-part documentary series on Showtime, looking back at the 1980s and the 4 kings of boxing, Leonard, Hagler, Hearns, Duran. I mean, what the heck are you doing? Let's bring in my friend and yours, a friend of boxing, a Hall of Famer, and the lead analyst on Showtime Boxing, Al Bernstein. Al, we got part 4 of this series, of this great documentary series, this Sunday night, 8 p.m. Eastern on Showtime. Of course, people can watch and binge all 4 episodes themselves on the Showtime app. You're a major voice in this documentary, and certainly one of the go-to people I could reach out to look back on this great era. But the era we're talking about is the 1980s, when these 4 great champions in and around the middleweight division fought each other 9 times in 10 years. It can be a ambitious thing to try to put that into a proper caption for this documentary series. What do you think has been the key and the strength for this coming together to be able to tell this story so perfectly?
Well, I think they've taken enough time doing 4 episodes that makes sense. You know, you can't do it in 45 minutes. And I think they've been well proportioned in terms of looking at each of the fighters and giving them each their due, and kind of exploring the dynamics of that time. And it was, you know, I was privileged to live that with them and announce many of those fights and be around virtually all of them. And it was an extraordinary time. And I don't know, you know, there are a lot of topics from the past that we feel at a certain point, well, we've found out most things we can find out, and we're pretty well satiated. But I don't think the 4 Kings is one of those things yet. And I think this documentary demonstrates that.
Yeah, the filmmakers did an incredible job, not only telling the story of those 9 fights in 10 years and how that really, you know, carried the sport, but connecting it with the cultural, political sort of same themes that were going on at the time. An ambitious effort in that regard. But Al, could you have had a better front row seat considering you were hired to ESPN in 1980, right when these 4 names, who, you know, to their own degree had been established, certainly, of course, Roberto Duran, who had been lightweight champion for a long time, but in the post Ali, Frazier, Foreman era, there was a real opening here for a new, you know, set of faces and stars, and your career sort of comes to the forefront right at the same time as theirs. When did you sort of realize that these guys were going to carry this sport into a new level and a new era, and maybe bring attention to weight classes that in the past weren't getting that close up like heavyweight had been?
Well, I was very lucky. You know, I started doing the ESPN series in 1980, and that series was only seen not on a lot of TV sets. ESPN was in its embryonic stages, but because Top Rank Boxing was doing the boxing series on ESPN, I was selected along with Sal Marciano to do the Hagler Duran fight in 1983, and I did the Hearns Hagler fight, of course, in 1985. So early in my career, and a number of other fights during that era, early in my career, I got an opportunity that fate gave me that I might not have had. And that gave me then a chance to kind of be a part of this whole thing. ESPN's boxing and ESPN grew in the 80s. Those 4, along with a lot of other great fighters in the 80s. The 80s was probably maybe the best decade boxing's ever had. And the time when I knew it was going to be special was when I was having breakfast with Gil Clancy, the great Gil Clancy, who was a former trainer and manager, and at that time, great TV broadcaster and a mentor to me. We're having breakfast, and I said, this is in the early 80s. I said, Gil, I said, this feels special to me, but I'm new to this. I said, you've seen everything. Is this special? And he said, yes. He said, this is different. This is going to be one of the great decades.
Incredible. So let's get it on the record here, Al. Of these 9 fights in 10 years, how many were you at? Which ones were you sort of, you know, lucky to be in the spot calling the fight? I mean, you had a front row to history in so many ways.
Yeah, I was involved in I did the Hagler Duran fight. I did Hagler Hearns, which was extraordinary. I was one of the hosts on the 3rd Duran Leonard fight, which was the last of the meetings between them. I did participate in a lot of fights involving the Four Kings that were important, like Roberto Duran and I ran Barkley, which was an important one. I did many Tommy Hearns fights and many Marvin Hagler fights as well. So I announced a lot of fights that they were involved with, and I think 3 or 4 of the 9 that they did. I was there for the Hagler Leonard fight. In fact, my claim to fame on that one was the first of my musical performances in Las Vegas. I did 3 nights in advance of that at Caesar's Palace. So that was, and then covered the fight for SportsCenter. So that was how I was involved with that one. But so I was at many of those fights, and of course they were all extraordinary events. And I believe this last episode deals with the Hagler Leonard fight and all that went into that.
Yeah, the twilights really of all 4 of their careers. Obviously, Hagler never fought again after the Ray Leonard fight, and then you got Leonard Hearns 2, a very underrated fight in the series. Of course, a disputed draw, but some great action. And then maybe Leonard Duran 3, if there's any forgettable fight of this great series, that might be it. But I was going to get into this later, but you jumped into it, Al. You're a Hall of Famer. You're a great analyst. You're a crooner as well. I am a collector of all things vinyl. This has been my new quarantine thing, really throwing all my money into my record collection. I went on eBay today, did a little extra research for this. There's a 1988 vinyl release available. Yes. It says very rare for 1995. Al Bernstein, My Very Own Songs, your debut album, which included the hits ESPN Blues, The Big Ring in the Sky. Al, I want to say not everybody knew about this. I didn't know about this. You got to tell me the story, how this came together.
Well, I was just starting to, the way the music thing happened was that Barry McGuigan's dad had, before Barry McGuigan fought at Caesar's Palace, was a singer from Ireland, a pub singer, and they had him do 3 nights at Caesar's Palace leading up to Danny Wiggins' fight. Or Barry McGuigan's fight with Cruz. And I was having dinner with the president of Caesar's Palace and some other people. And he said, don't you sing here in town and sit in with a lot of people, which I did because and I said, yeah. He said, well, wait a second. You have to do 3 nights before the Hagler Leonard fight. And I'm like, oh, okay. I didn't have an act. I didn't have a band. I had nothing. I did that. And that's what started the music thing. And then I did this album of specialty material with the song ESPN Blues and other things, and that launched me onto doing music.
Now, how many copies do you still own of this great record, Al?
That's a funny question. I do not have a single vinyl copy. So I do have some CDs, but not that many.
Okay, I mean, you could go on eBay right now, Al, for a couple bucks.
I think I better go get one. Yeah, now you've told me something very important because, and whose life is complete without having at least one copy of that?
Hey, this is a true boxing fan can only add this to close off their collection. But in all seriousness, Al, you had a front row for it. We talked about it, and your colleague, of course, and mine, Steve Farhood of Showtime, the Hall of Famer as well, had that great quote in the doc of that might have been the greatest decade in boxing history, something you just noted to. And I hadn't really, it's funny, I had never thought of that. We think of the 1970s as like, when heavyweight boxing mattered, and the 90s were like a sneaky heavyweight renaissance. Yeah. And depending on, the decades earlier, when you grew up in the rise of Joe Louis or Sugar Ray Robinson or whomever, that may have been considered a great time. I don't think I've heard that said as bluntly that the 80s were the best time, yet it's with the combination of the Four Kings and Mike Tyson, that kind of makes a lot of sense. It's really hard to necessarily argue.
And a lot more than that, Arguello Pryor and all the great fighters. That era that decade had more great fights and more great fighters in it than I think certainly any since. And I relied on, and I had, of course, watched on my own the 70s and parts of the 60s, but Gil was, my guideline, Gil Clancy on it. But even before that, there were great decades for boxing. But I think to get all these great fights, you had the Four Kings, you had Pryor Arguello, you had all these other Larry Holmes, you had all these great fighters. You had at the end of the throughout the decade. And you had all these great fights and fighters. And I just think it was a special time for the sport.
No, it really was. I mean, I feel lucky to have. I was born in 1978. The first time I knew what boxing was, aside from the Rocky movies, was seeing Hagler Hearns replayed all over television.
Right.
Probably your call, Al. I always tell you were the voice of my youth with your great work on SportsCenter with Charlie Steiner back in the day. But Hagler Leonard, for example, was the first pay-per-view my dad,
Right.
not a sports fan, who bought and had a party. I mean, the amount that became front page news again in the sporting
Right.
world and beyond. I guess it is hard to argue in that regard. I mean, this spin-off question and discussion is one we always have as boxing guys. Can we get back to that? How can we get back to that? It would have to be the best fighting the best, regardless of anything, no matter what. I mean, you had 4 Hall of Famers willing to constantly round robin face each other for, not for peanuts, for giant prizes and millions of pay-per-view money, but it was that willingness. Will we see that willingness again? Things are cyclical and circular in a lot of ways, but how do we get back to that?
Well, part of the thing too that made it so special back then was there was, now there are so many more things vying for our attention. The elder sports are much more niche sports. Back then it was easy, if there was a fight between the 4 kings, they were on Good Morning America. And boxing isn't in that position right now. And even for any sport, it's hard to carve out your attention from the public because we're so segmentized. So it's a difficult task. One of the most important things is what you're saying, though, for people to fight each other and make these big fights. Now, we've seen some of that happen a little better in boxing in the last several years. There's been movement toward that. The next time boxing saw something like the 4 kings, in my opinion, was, though it didn't reach that height, of course, was Marco Antonio Barrera, Manny Pacquiao, Juan Manuel
Marquez, Eric Morales.
Yeah, and also Eric Morales. And those 4 guys fought the greatest fights against each other. They all fought each other, and it was a great moment for boxing. It's hard to get that. There's potential in boxing today to create those kind of rivalries, and we're seeing some of it, like in the 154-pound division, where people are all fighting each other, but they're not, maybe there's not as much star power. And boxing's trying to make that happen. It's a more difficult process. That alone won't make it happen, Brian, but it will pave the way for it.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I think, you could argue that we've seen some great growth. As you said, we're seeing Tyson Fury and Deontay Wilder on separate networks and promoters being forced together. And maybe we've got, to try to say, will there ever be another 4 kings? And that group of featherweights or so you just mentioned was a great group. We've got a really fun heavyweight era right now. If we can just get these guys to consistently, the Joshuas, Wilders, Furies, Usyks, Ortiz's, whatever, to keep facing each other, maybe we can get there. I know you as well as I look at that group of lightweights that we also have that are young right now. The Gervonta Davises, Devin Haney, Ryan Garcia, Teofimo Lopez. How different, though, Al, in the idea of those guys? They might not be nearly as great as the 4 kings. Who knows? We're going to find out in their career. But to get them to consistently fight each other, what's the difference in your eyes to the structure of where boxing was in the 80s to now? Not from the standpoint of it being more of a household sport then, but in terms of now when you're aligned with a network, you're almost segregated like an American National League. Was that there at times in the 80s? How was that more easily overcome?
Yeah, it was more fractured. It's more fractured now. There's no question about that. It's more fractured because of network alliances, because of promoters, not being able to figure out a way to get these, and because you have to be honest, people don't seem as willing to figure out ways to face each other. And fighters are fighting less often. They're not fighting as many times during the year. So the chances of making those big matches become less. There are significant, barriers. The trick is to get past most of the barriers, so at least you can make some of them. Whether your expectations are that, how high your expectations are, but those 4 lightweights are a perfect example. And they're going to fluctuate in weight. And that's another thing. People fluctuate in weight more often now than they did back then.
Yeah, certainly with the rise of the 17 weight divisions and all that, boxing's a wild game. But when you look back at what these 4 fighters, Hagler, Hearns, Leonard, and Duran, brought to the sport and their imprint from fighting each other, how would you describe how much must-see TV each of these matchups were?
They were huge. They were, they captured the imagination of literally everyone. And some of them, like the Hagler Leonard, I think was on Monday, or Hagler Hearns was on a Monday night. Some of these were not on weekends, and they were, and of course, each of them would fight on network TV many times to get a lot of people to know them, right? That was another thing. And then that would feed the pay-per-view fights that they had amongst each other. And it's hard to even explain how much it dominated the landscape of the sporting world when they fought at Caesar's Palace or somewhere else, and the world focused their eyes on them. It was just remarkable. And people are always, it's like, oh, the good old days, I don't want to over sentimentalize it, but it was extraordinary. It was, the focus of everyone seemed to be on those fights. And it's hard to minimize the impact it had on the sporting world.
No, I don't think you can overstate it, because you can go back and watch it and see for yourself. You can watch this documentary series and see the reactions of people all these years later. It certainly mattered. Do you have a favorite fight of the great 9 matchups against each other in this 10-year span, Al?
For me, I guess it would have to be Hagler Hearns, because I did that fight, and more importantly, it was ironically, right, it wasn't a long fight. That first round was really the whole thing, basically. But it was only 2.5 rounds. But I guess that one resonates with me as much as any, because it was just so exciting, and it was 2 fighters putting it all on the line. And but there were other very dramatic fights. The first Duran Leonard fight was a remarkable fight. It was extraordinary. Tommy Hearns and Leonard number 3 that you pointed out, maybe they were a little diminished, but they showed their amazing, abilities in that fight. So you could look at a number of them. And then the other thing is they participated in great fights with other people, like Hagler Mugabe and Duran against Barkley. So they had such an amazing resume during that period that you can point to so many great fights.
Yeah, it's hard to top Hagler Hearns, considering it's
that one's the tough
sort
one
of
to top.
The go-to comparison of savagery and entertainment in a video game sort of setting in a real fight. When you look back at those fights, which one do you think had the biggest buzz in the build? If there's a way to say what was the most anticipated matchup of those 9, which one would you point to?
Probably Hagler Leonard, because they were so huge, and Leonard coming back, and toward the end of Hagler's career, I think the build-up to that fight was probably as big as any of the fights. And the first Leonard Hearns fight was extraordinary in terms of its build-up as well. So, but I'm going to go with Hagler Leonard.
Yeah, no question about it. To close here, Al, it's been great looking back with you and sort of setting the stage for anybody that is not following The Kings, the 4-part documentary series. Part 4 this Sunday night, 8 p.m. Eastern and Pacific on Showtime. Is again just celebrating what we look back on. If they're all 4 are Hall of Famers, all 4 fought each other, and in a lot of cases sort of traded wins and losses. Is there a way to say there's one king that stands brighter than the most? Roberto Duran has a great quote in there. He says, I'm the oldest. Maybe they can all look at me and call me Poppy, call me Daddy. Is there one king, just looking at the matchups against each other, that you feel like might have a chance to say, I came out of here, the shiniest of this great rivalry
I guess
series?
Leonard ended up with the best record of them, though, you know, in terms of wins and losses, if you accept that he won the Hagler fight, which many people, you know, that was a disputed decision, obviously. So I guess maybe he'd have the bragging rights in terms of the numbers. I find it hard to make determinations. Duran had the worst record of the three, so he didn't fare that well overall against his former, you know, four kings. But it's hard for me to make determinations on it because all four of them in their total career provided things that were so unique that I don't know how I'd even determine them. If we're basing it just on a rivalry, you know, Leonard won more often, so I guess he'd get the nod.
Yeah, but obviously had that disputed draw as well against Hearns. Many people thought he had lost that rematch, and even if Duran has the worst record of the four, some people can say from a pound for pound standpoint, he might be the best, you know, considering the full totality of his career. These were the legends. And now you were one of those voices that had the chance to go along on that journey. You're a Hall of Famer. You've seen so many eras, but do you ever sort of just sit around and pinch yourself and say, you know, I got it on the ground floor at a pretty damn good
I think about that. I think about it seriously, frequently, because I was very fortunate. And you talk about the Hall of Fame. When I was going into the Hall of Fame, you know, Tommy Hearns, of course, he was going in that year, and Michael Buffer was there, and Freddie Roach was there. And I joke that we were going in the Hall of Fame because we survived the 80s, which is a whole nother story. It was a decadent time back then. But, you know, I think of so many, we all have different things happen to us that are fortunate for us. And I was just lucky to come along at that time. And it was extraordinary. And so I do pinch myself and say that was the idea of having lived through it and been a part of it is one of the most rewarding things that could happen to me.
And you had the stash, Al. I know you got the goatee now, but the stash is iconic, right? I mean, you know,
I only had it off for maybe 4 months in the last 40 years. So it's been there the whole time.
It's iconic. Al Bernstein, thank you for your time. We love your work. Thanks, on Showtime Brian. Championship Boxing. Be well, sir.
Good to see you, as always.